This is Under the Lens, featuring economic research by Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. The content of this presentation is strictly the opinion of Gordon T. Long and is based on facts he feels to be accurate as a result of his research at this time. All listeners are advised to independently verify all research for market changes. The following opinions are not in any way a solicitation for business, nor should they be considered investment advice. You should always consult a registered investment advisor before making investment decisions. Now, let's join Gordon for today's show.
It is Thursday, October 20th, 2016. I'm Gord Long. As is normally the case, I have a lot of charts for us to go through this morning, so therefore I will pass over some of them quickly, but leave you to examine them further at your leisure. You'll need to open your viewer to full screen viewing, or you'll not be able to see some of the detail I'll be discussing. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. The purpose of the audio is to discuss key developments in those areas not specifically updated in this month's Global Macro Tipping Points Research Report document. The research document this month updates regional developments. Therefore, the slides this morning will focus on our other three report areas of the GMTP report: global risk, macro, and U.S. economic developments. As I often do, I like to tie them together into a discussion on why I now consider financial repression as being in play. In this regard, I like to cover the following subject areas shown here. What is little appreciated today is that the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment Act in 1978 assisted in birthing financial repression and placing us firmly on the monetary policy path the Federal Reserve is presently imprisoned by. Deep state planners fully understood then that employment would become an increasingly larger problem in America and within the developed nations as leveraged buyouts with immediate downsizing, right-sizing, and outsourcing were beginning to dominate the financial engineering game of the day. Driven by the political concerns in the late 1970s about rising unemployment, the Humphrey-Hawkins legislation in 1978 fundamentally compelled the U.S. central banks to drive interest rates progressively lower. Casual observers of the Fed speak of the dual mandate for U.S. monetary policy incorporating full employment and price stability, but careful reading of the Humphrey-Hawkins law shows that the former is paramount and must be satisfied by the Fed before price stability may be considered. Federal Reserve chairs have followed the single mandate of full employment to its logical conclusion, namely zero interest rates and the expropriation of private income. With the peak in nominal rates in the late 1970s, the Fed switched priorities and became focused on the single mandate of full employment. This policy fixation on targeting at least nominal employment had significant costs, including a steady level of underlying inflation that has slowly undermined consumer purchasing power. Thus, today, the discussion of income inequality. The single mandate of full employment also facilitated periodic financial bubbles and crises resulting from the manic swings in Fed policy. In 20th century America, credit has been used to increase sales as opposed to forcing consumers to save sufficient cash to purchase an automobile or home, for example, in the future. The judicious use of credit increased demand for goods and services and employment. Today, however, the policy of using ever cheaper credit to pull tomorrow's demand into the present day seemingly has lost its efficiency. With most nation states yet unwilling or unable to use fiscal expansion to stoke short-term demand, global central banks acting alone have been asked to somehow address the burdens of global overcapacity, excess debt, rising unemployment, and slack consumer demand. This is simply an impossible feat, and I expect to see a dramatic swing towards fiscal stimulus in 2017 across the developed world. The roadmap shown here is one we put together in 2011 and updated in 2012 on what we saw unfolding if the central bankers were to continue on their then policy plans. They did, and in fact accelerated them with QE3, Operation Twist, and most recently NERP, negative interest rate policy. It has led to the inevitable outcome of dysfunctional markets, malinvestment, investor and public delusion. The stated goals of the central banks have failed to materialize, as they continuously double down as they see that to be the perceived solution. 2% inflation has not been achieved, as we see more signs of potential deflationary depression looming. Full employment is claimed to be achieved, but we have nearly 100,000 people outside the workforce, nearly 50,000 on food stamps, and the only jobs being created are low-paying part-time jobs which won't support a family, forcing both parents to often work 2 jobs to simply survive. The simple fact is that the rate of credit growth is now too slow, is decelerating, and no longer achieves the level of growth it once did at comparable levels. This can be seen in a simplified back-of-the-envelope calculation shown here. Wealth creation can't carry the existing debt load, which is perceived to require further expansion to achieve required stimulus growth. The gap must be shouldered by the central banks expanding their balance sheets, requiring continuous expansion. It is an almost predetermined path, and the Bernanke doctrine of enrich thy neighbor is being executed by the central banks of what I've often referred to as the currency cartel, the ECB, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of England. That is, the sterling, the dollar, the yen, and the euro. One of the major problems going forward is that an aging population in most of the major countries in the world has reached the point where they start to historically spend less. The wrong development at exactly the wrong time for the global economy. These are unintended consequences. Let me give you an example of an unintended consequence. Though the Samsung Galaxy Note 7 battery problem is presently receiving a tremendous amount of media and public attention, what few appreciate is that it is only the tip of the iceberg of cracks in the global supply chain. As a result of unintended consequences of these central bank monetary policies, economists have been preoccupied since the 2008 financial crisis with stimulating economic growth through policies which attempt to create demand. It is debatable whether these Keynesian stimulus programs have succeeded, but what isn't debatable is that cheap money has exploded global supply. Though corporate profits are presently at all-time highs, revenue growth and margins are rolling over, and cash flows are falling, this has been placing incredible pressures throughout the global supply chain. It is resulting in deteriorating product quality when considered in light of total cost of ownership and whether the customer is actually getting more for less or whether they are now receiving less for more. When you cut costs, you can only go so far. Then you have to cut corners. Pressures to cheat are now not just the purview of Wells Fargo, which we saw recently or heard of recently as they testified before Congress, but additionally the Samsung Galaxy Note 7 battery problem illustrates that we are only seeing, as I said, the tip of the iceberg of quality concerns, which is likely to soon emerge more consistently in the media. The central bankers are capable of achieving many extraordinary results. But not all economic and financial problems can be solved by central bankers. Central bankers, for example, have the power to solve liquidity issues, but it is impossible for them to solve solvency issues. Central banks, through financial repression, can, for example, transfer risk. However, they can't remove it from the system. Additionally, central bankers may be able to delay a recession slightly, but they can't prevent the business cycle from running its course. It's this inability to control the business cycle which has the potential to be the trigger that brings the great central bank bubble to an end. The U.S. is by most comparisons overdue a recession occurring. Unfortunately, the next recession is going to happen when the central banks are least capable of even slowing this inevitability. I will talk a little more about this chart in a moment. But you can see we have many types of cycles, all heading down at exactly the same time. A highly unusual occurrence, but which Harry Dent says there is a very specific reason for. The malinvestment that recessions normally cleanse has reached such a level that deteriorating real total business investment has diverged from the S&P 500 index, as well as commercial and industrial loans. In our opinion, which we have labeled here, sound business investment has shifted from being distorted to what can only now be described as simply broken. Every recession on record but one has signaled the 4 warnings outlined here. That one exception had a complete different economic climate than the one we're in. The chances of a U.S. recession in 2017 can only be considered highly likely. The problem with the next recession is that the distortions and leverage in the system will quite likely quickly cascade into an unmanageable economic situation and likely a full-scale protracted depression. I am showing here some work we have done at the Financial Repression Authority in how to view the key building blocks upon which macroprudential policies of financial repression are built: inflation targeting, negative real rates, ring-fencing regulations, and data and information obfuscation. Here is the roadmap we laid out well over a year ago, which has unfolded almost exactly as we predicted. I'll come back to this diagram also in a moment. The central banks have clearly painted themselves into a corner as a result of their self-inflicted, extended period of cheap money. Their policies have fostered malinvestment, excessive leverage, and a speculative casino approach to investments. Investors forced to take on excess risk for yield and scalp speculative investment returns must operate in an unstable financial environment ripe for a major correction. A correction because of the high degree of market correlation that likely would be instantaneously contagious across all global financial markets. Any correction more than 10%, I feel the Federal Reserve and central banks believe must be stopped. As a result of the level of instability, even a 10% correction consolidation could get quickly out of control, so any correction becomes a major risk. What the central banks are acutely aware of is, if collateral values were to fall, with the excess financial leverage currently in place, it would create a domino effect of margin calls, counterparty risk, and immediate withdrawals and flight to areas of perceived safety. The already massively underfunded pension sector, which is now beginning to experience the onslaught of baby boomers retiring, which brings this Ponzi scheme really to light, would see their remaining assets impaired. This would lead to social and political pressures that would be simply unmanageable for our policy leaders. A falling stock market is the surest way of alarming consumers and signaling that things are not okay, as the media mantra has continuously brainwashed them into believing. In a 70% consumption economy, a worried consumer almost guarantees a further economic slowdown and a potential recession. As our Western society continues to consume more than it produces, productivity is not increasing at the rate that justifies the developed nation's standard of living, as well as the current levels of equity markets. A possible corrective drawdown to the degree shown in this chart is simply out of the question. The central bankers are acutely aware of this. The markets are presently temporarily held up due to primarily 3 factors: historical levels of corporate stock buybacks, the chasing of dividend-paying stocks for investment yield in a NERP environment, and unusual foreign central bank buying, for example, the Central Bank of Switzerland. Professionals, institutions, hedge funds, etc., have been steadily lightening up on equity markets, or simply leaving the public holding the bag. It is estimated that $325 billion will leave the U.S. equity markets in 2016 and will be replaced by an artificial $450 billion of corporations buying back their stocks. With corporate cash flows now falling and debt burdens triggering potential credit rating downgrades, the game is quickly slowing. The central banks are also well aware of this. The market technicians of all persuasions are almost unanimously calling for a major correction. What is most troubling here is that their indicators are not just short and intermediate term measures, but critical long-term indicators. The Kondratiev cycle. The 55-year generational Kondratiev cycle shows an overdue major downturn, with the cleansing of debt as part of the end to what has been termed the debt supercycle. Demographic cycles. And this is the chart I showed earlier. Harry Dent has done some major work on demographic cycles and cycles overall. I interviewed him for the Financial Repression Authority, where you can find the video, and he lays out the seriousness of shifting demographics and how it overlays on the many different types of cycles he's studied. And all of a sudden, or I should say, at this period of time, all of these cycles are overlapping in a downtrend. And that has a lot to do with post-war generational baby boom bubble around the world, and all reaching a certain point in their life where they're no longer spending at the same rate, according to Harry. Elliott Wave. The technicians who study Elliott Wave see clear evidence that we are now completing a multi-decade topping pattern in the form of a classic megaphone top. And I've been studying Elliott Wave for quite a number of years, and it's just been a steady progression to this unfolding pattern. It's not like they just drew this up in the last 6 weeks or even the last 6 years. You've seen it unfolding steadily with each of these bubbles since 2000. The central banks are aware of this also. If you look at technical fundamentals, I could keep on illustrating the types of warnings we're seeing, but let me share what the central bankers likely are most concerned about regarding correlation, liquidity, and volatility ETPs. The markets have become so correlated. Think of this as everyone on the same side of the boat, with asset correlations not only being higher, but the correlations themselves are becoming more correlated. While traditionally the rising cross-asset volatility has resulted in volatility spike, that is no longer the case due to outright volatility suppression by the central banks. While central banks may have given the superficial impression of stability by pressuring volatility, they have also collapsed liquidity in the process, leading to less liquid markets, a surge in gaps, and jerky moves that are typical of penny stocks. The greater the cross-asset correlation, the lower the volatility, the greater the repression, the more trading illiquidity and wider bid-ask spreads, and ultimately increasing gap risk, which becomes a feedback loop of its own. Global central banks are now injecting a record $2.5 trillion in fungible liquidity every year, in the process further fragmenting and fracturing an illiquid market which is only fit for notoriously dangerous penny stocks. More than $50 billion is poured into low volatility indexed exchange traded funds over the past 5 years or so. In the wake of the 2008-2009 market meltdown, there are now 14 low volatility ETFs with assets exceeding $100 million each, and many more with less. Whenever the market hits a pothole, these ETFs enjoy a bump up in assets. Even more concerning are volatility ETPs, or exchange-traded products, which are derivatives of some underlying assets. Volatility ETFs are particularly strange animals since you're buying a derivative, ETF, on a derivative, the futures contract, which itself is based on a derivative, the implied volatility of options, and those options themselves, of course, are derivatives which themselves are based on the S&P 500. Getting the picture? The folks at Capital Exploits warn, and I quote, "Everyone is on the low volatility side of the boat because the central banks have managed to create a sense of calm in the markets exhibited by record lows in volatility, and investors have used linear thinking, extrapolating well into the future, assuming ever greater risk, ignoring market cycles and extremes at their peril. Every time you sell volatility, you get paid by the counterparty, who is typically hedging the volatility, going long, of a particular position and paying you for the privilege. This is not unlike paying a home insurance premium, where the insurer takes the ultimate risk of your house burning down and you pay them for the privilege. The difference, however, between selling volatility in order to protect against an underlying position and selling volatility in order to receive the yield created is enormous. And yet this is the game being played. The central banks have managed to create a sense of calm in the market exhibited by record lows in volatility, and for their part, Joe Sixpack investor has used linear thinking, extrapolating well into the future, assuming ever greater risk, ignoring market cycles and extremes at their peril. Again, none of this is going unnoticed by the increasingly worried central bankers. So what can the central bankers be expected to do? We laid out this roadmap well over a year ago. We anticipated in our macroprudential research much of what has now become mainstream discussion. Helicopter money, now openly discussed, fiscal infrastructure stimulus, which has become part of the candidate selection platforms, collateral guarantees, we're seeing that where they're buying corporate bonds now and at the ECB and the Bank of England, plus more collateral guarantees on the horizon. We now believe the central bankers, and the Federal Reserve specifically, are preparing for more in the way of these collateral guarantees. We believe it will actually take the form of direct buying of the U.S. stock market, similar to what the Bank of Japan is already doing with ETF purchases. What we have is a potential Minsky Melta. My longtime macro analytics co-host John Rubino concludes in his most recent writing, Floodgates Begin to Open, and I quote, individual countries have in the past tried temporarily higher rates of inflation, and the result has always and everywhere been a kind of runaway train that either jumps the tracks or slams into some stationary object with ugly results. In other words, the higher consumption and investment that might initially be generated by rising inflation are more than offset by the greater instability that such a policy guarantees. But never before has the whole world entered monetary panic mode at the same time, which implies that little about what's coming can be said with certainty. It's at least probable that a combination of massive deficit spending and effectively unlimited money creation will indeed generate growth of some kind. But it's also probable that once started, this process will begin to quickly spin out of control, as everyone realizes that in a world where governments are actively generating inflation, that is, actively devaluing the currencies, it makes sense to borrow as much as possible and spend the proceeds on whatever real things are available at whatever price. Whether the result is called a crack-up boom or a runaway demand pull inflation or some new term economists coined to shift the blame, it will be an epic mess. And apparently it's coming. End of quote. I think John nailed it there. It is our considered opinion that the monetary policy setters are presently even more worried about the current global economic situation than we are, if that is possible. This is evident because over the last 14 days, Fed Chairman Janet Yellen, former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers, and even J.P. Morgan have all been out talking openly and publicly about the possible consideration of policy changes that would allow the Federal Reserve to buy U.S. equities. These releases must be seen as trial balloons to condition expectations. Japan and Switzerland, among others, are already doing it, as we previously reported, while the ECB is also floating its own trial balloon on the same subject. If you want to know what could create a Minsky melt-up, this is it. This chart here shows our latest Financial Repression Authority macro map illustrating what we see unfolding, which we believe the die has now been cast. The U.S. Federal Reserve can soon be expected sometime in later 2017 to get congressional approval for equity purchases. Of course, this will take a post-election scare of significant proportions and a new Congress to pass that legislation, a panicked Congress. In closing, remember the answer will be to print more money. It is the only answer politicians will ever agree on, until no one wants it or trusts it, invests accordingly. As negative as these comments often are, there has seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2016 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. Thank you for listening.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.